Hey guys, today's video, which is actually the result of a subscriber topic request that came to me actually via Instagram, so thank you very much for that, is focused on aligning your training approaches with muscle fiber types. So what does that even mean? Well, stay tuned to find out. Okay, first things first. So skeletal muscle cells, so the muscle cells we're all concerned about, are called muscle fibers. So I'm going to be using that term pretty much throughout the entire video. Now, these muscle fibers can be generally divided into three main groups, and there may actually be up to at least 5 groups, but we're going to stick with 3 main types. Group 1, so the type 1 muscle fibers, which are smaller and called the slow twitch muscle fibers. Type 2 are larger and they are called fast twitch, and there are actually at least two main members, so type 2A and type 2X, formerly known as type 2B. Now, the names fast and slow describe essentially how quickly they're able to generate force or their overall power output. Now, even though the type 1 or slow twitch fibers are pretty slow to contract, they're also pretty slow to fatigue, and so they can continue contracting pretty much as long as you need them to. Type 2 or fast twitch fibers are larger, contract quickly, but also fatigue pretty quickly. Now, all muscles have, all types of muscle fibers, and with very few exceptions, most muscles have an approximately equal proportion of slow and fast twitch, so roughly 50-50. Of course, there's some differences in exceptional cases, and I won't get into those. Now, of course, there's genetic variation between individuals, but we're not going to complicate the video with genetic variation. We're just going to assume for the purposes of this conversation that everybody's pretty much similar in their makeup. I've actually covered the very basics of skeletal muscle structure in an earlier video, so definitely go back, check that out for more background information after you watch this video. It will, help to lend some additional context to what you hear in this video. The link is in the description below. Go check it out. All right, so onto the question. Should you, and if yes, how should you factor in muscle fiber types into your training in order to maximize muscle growth or hypertrophy? Again, muscle growth or hypertrophy is our goal. So, step 1, how do you even trigger muscle hypertrophy in the first place? And again, something that I've covered in a previous video, link is below, but in a very basic sense, in a nutshell, you need to expose the muscle cells to at least 3 types of stress at a high enough level. First stressor, tension or mechanical stress. So you need to force muscle fibers to contract to generate as much force as they possibly can. Number 2, metabolic stress. So you need to cause them to generate energy by consuming fuel sources at a high rate. And thirdly, you need to cause some what we call micro damage, so small amounts of physical damage to the structure of the muscle cells in order to trigger growth as well as repair for future anticipation of greater force demands. So with hypertrophy, considering the 3 fiber types, do they all have the same potential for growth? Because that's going to lead into our conversation of how to incorporate different strategies into our training if we're going to focus on fiber type for overall hypertrophy. Now, some studies suggest that the larger fast twitch fibers actually have a 50% greater growth potential as compared with the smaller type 1 or slow twitch fibers. But as with anything else in science, there are other studies that suggest that they all have similar potential for growth, but under certain conditions. And I'll get to the specifics of those conditions shortly. Okay, now let's cause the stress that we need in these muscle fibers by making them do some work. How? Well, the first thing to remember is that nerves actually stimulate muscle fibers to contract, and a group of muscle fibers and their associated nerve fiber is what is known as a motor unit. Now, smaller motor units, so smaller muscle fibers, have a lower threshold for recruitment and therefore are recruited for contraction first, followed by the larger motor units. Generally speaking then, type 1 fibers are recruited first, followed by type 2A, and then finally type 2X. So low intensity work recruits type 1 fibers, then if and when more force is needed for a greater intensity or greater weight, moving a greater load, the type 2A fibers get recruited, and then if still more force is needed, then the type 2X fibers get involved. So it would then seem logical to you to do low intensity work to force the growth of type 1 fibers since you're interested in hypertrophy. So lightweight with a higher rep range, and since these muscle fibers take a longer time to fatigue, a longer duration or longer time under tension, and then needing perhaps shorter rest periods. Then it would seem logical to use heavier weight then to stimulate the fast twitch fibers, using a lower rep range since they're going to fatigue faster, and then you're going to need longer rest periods in order to recover. So the question becomes, should you really then just focus most of your work on using heavy weights since they're going to stimulate the fast twitch fibers and they are larger to begin with and possibly have an even greater growth potential compared to the type 1s? Well, that sounds like it would be a pretty reasonable assumption, except as with anything else in science or biology, it's just not that simple. So, first you would need to know how heavy you'd need to lift in order to recruit those fast twitch fibers in the first place. And we do have some data that suggests that intensities above 50 or 60% is sufficient to trigger hypertrophy in those fast twitch muscle fibers. But now we also know from other studies that at intensities above between 30 and 40% of your 1 rep max, the rate of what is known as post-exercise protein synthesis, so the rate of production of new protein for repairing the muscle and for the growth of the cells, is roughly similar between the slow twitch and the fast twitch fibers if, and this is a big if, at that low intensity, the exercise continues to concentric failure. Now, importantly, this observation at the level of protein synthesis has also been shown to be true at the level of whole muscle hypertrophy, so hypertrophy of the entire muscle. Now, with that, we have evidence that the growth potential of type 1 and type 2 fibers may actually be pretty similar if, again, you're training to failure. So there's another super important observation that tells us that specifically targeting type 2 muscle fibers alone with heavy weight may not necessarily be the answer that you're looking for, because there are smarter ways based on that information. As it turns out, even though the fast twitch fibers have a high intensity threshold in order to be recruited, that high threshold gets even lower when fatigue begins to kick in. What does that mean? So what that means is at low intensity work, as the type 1 fibers begin to fatigue, the recruitment of the type 2 fibers gets easier. It occurs at a lower threshold in order for them to chip in to continue to move the load that you are trying to ask your body to move. Now, since we have all this information and we have a goal of maximizing hypertrophy, how on earth should we actually think about executing or training overall? Should you actually even care? Should you focus your efforts at all on muscle fiber composition and trying to tailor your workouts accordingly? Well, the first thing is, if you're thinking of it from a person-to-person variation standpoint, is it's not technically simple to determine your fiber predisposition or the ratio of fiber types in your own body. It can be very roughly estimated from your ability to lift heavy weights, but of course that's affected by a ton of factors, including, number one, the muscle that you're actually assessing. Also, the influence of what actually exercise you're doing, since it's easier or harder to perform some reps on some exercises versus others. And then, of course, the issue of your level of skill at executing the specific exercise. And then there's the fact that the number of reps you're able to get at a particular intensity isn't necessarily an awesome predictor of your fiber composition in the first place. Now, you could do something significantly more complex. You could technically sample and biopsy a bunch of your muscles, but that seems pretty extreme and obviously will be very expensive. And with the training strategies that I'll provide for you, it's really totally unnecessary. The bottom line really is that with essentially equivalent absolute growth potential of fast and slow twitch fibers under specific conditions, it makes sense to approach your programming in order to maximize the growth of each type. And this is how you're going to go about doing that. First and most important thing is to include both low and high intensity work in your training program. Secondly, you're going to want to take your low intensity exercises often to failure. Not every time. This is not only going to maximally stress the slow twitch fibers to grow, but then as they fatigue, you're going to be able to recruit the fast twitch fibers to get them to contribute to the work. Now, depending on your training experience, when you're ready, when you have acquired the skill and the stability, you can then begin to use advanced training techniques in your training in order to increase the time under tension for each set. How can you do that? Advanced techniques such as drop sets, where you start with a heavier weight to challenge those fast twitch fibers first to do work, and then as they fatigue, you drop down to a lower weight or intensity, and then you begin to stress the type 1 or slow twitch fibers even more. Additionally, you can use rest pause sets, in which the short breaks between reps within the set can help you to then again maximally stress all the fiber types. But importantly, you need to be careful and very judicious in how you approach number one, straight sets to failure and drop sets and rest pause sets, because you want to protect against very extreme levels of fatigue and general overuse. The fourth thing you want to think about is incorporating a periodization approach into your programming. Now, this is a huge area of research and contention, but there are many ways that you can periodize your workouts. But the basic general idea is that you're going to essentially plan periods or phases of low intensity, high rep range work with high intensity, low rep range training. And such periodized approaches have been demonstrated to be significantly more effective for hypertrophy and indeed for strength as well than programs that are not periodized. Very basically, you can use either a linear stepwise progression over a defined training cycle of whatever length it is that you choose, or you can periodize in a nonlinear manner where intensity changes on a daily or on a weekly or a bi-weekly basis, and so on. Now, to be sure, in this video there are a number of factors that I have not covered here at all in order to keep the content relatively straightforward. But if you're interested in more details on the topic, for sure you can look into some of the things I'll mention in a second, or you can just comment below with a question and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. So things that I haven't covered: compound versus isolation exercises and intensity and how that ties into training for muscle fiber type. The metabolic profiles of the different fiber types. I haven't covered the potential for fibers to switch between one or the other type. I haven't really gotten into fiber type composition of different muscles or the very specific details of how to measure fiber type composition within a person or within a specific muscle. We haven't touched force generation capacity of the different fiber types or the existence and how many intermediate fiber types there may be. Now, one thing that you'll note is that I've completely focused on hypertrophy as the goal. I haven't covered endurance exercise or training for strength or training for power and speed because the question really was centered around hypertrophy. The conversation would have been somewhat different if we were to consider the other adaptations or the other goals. Now, if you need help with figuring out your programming and periodization, also feel free to let me know by leaving a note in the comments or heading over to my Instagram and sending me a DM. I'd be happy to try to help you out. But as usual, without getting into too much detail here, I really hope the video was helpful to you, in order to understand that yes, there are different fiber types which respond to different training approaches, but more importantly, that there are straightforward ways that you can maximize overall muscle hypertrophy using techniques that you're probably already aware of and probably already incorporating. So it's a matter of incorporating them differently or more strategically. Of course, let me know that you found the video to be beneficial by giving it a thumbs up. Now, for you and anyone else that you know who is interested in weekly videos on how to achieve your fitness and physique potential, then definitely you need to be subscribed to the channel. I'd welcome any comments and ideas that you have. I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to leave comments below. I want to make sure that the content that I'm creating is, what you're going to find most helpful and beneficial in your training journey. Until the next video, guys, as always, aloha from beautiful Kauai.